Hey everyone and welcome to this video. In this one, we are going to cover some core concepts of Next.js. We are going to talk about client-side rendering, server-side rendering, static site generation, a bit about incremental site regeneration as well, or incremental static regeneration. And we'll also look into how do we identify if a component is client-side rendered or not. We're also going to talk about how Next.js caches some of the requests. And we'll also look into when you build a particular Next.js product or project and you deploy it to Vercel, what really happens and how you identify static generated pages versus dynamic pages. So let's get into it right away. And before we start, of course, as always, please make sure to leave a like on this video if you find this useful and subscribe to the channel if you have not already, because I see only 15% of the overall views are coming from subscribers and everyone else is new and not subscribing. Having said that, let's talk about these concepts: client-side rendering, server-side rendering, and ISR and whatnot. We're going to first talk about client-side rendering. Theoretically, whenever you go to a particular page, for example, if I'm going to exalidraw.com, essentially what happens is that my browser basically requests the information from server. So this is what's happening. It's trying to request the information from the backend. The server essentially sends back the HTML right away. So for example, the server sends back the HTML to the browser. And then once the browser has it, if you're talking about a React application, then React kicks in and then it renders the whole UI. So for example, if the header was a component, if the sidebar was a component, then what we would get back just in terms of HTML would not be the entire UI, would be a very minimal HTML, and then React renders all these components on the browser after the browser has received the HTML. If you don't yet believe what I said, let's actually have a look at one application that is a React application. So this is Andy. He is actually one of the developers that I'm training right now at Salt, and he has built a cool project for his hack day. This is salt.map, which essentially allows anyone who is a salty or who has worked at Salt, and they can go write their name and then they can put a place, for example here, and then they can put a pin on the map. Now this is a React application. If I go and refresh this page, you can see that I see the React magic here. So all of the app is right here. But what if I only want to see what comes from the server when I try to request? Because as I saw in Exalidraw, the browser gets the information from the HTML and then React kicks in. Does that mean if I try to go to this page and if I disable my JavaScript, which means I disable React on the front end or the client-side rendering at all, what would I see then? You can check it directly by just right-clicking and clicking View Page Source. When you do that, it tells you what it actually receives from the server. In this situation, since this is deployed to GitHub, we're talking about the GitHub server. Now you could have deployed this to Netlify, Heroku, wherever you want to do it, and then you'll get back essentially an HTML. This is the HTML that you get back in a normal React application. So if you're working on a React application based on Create React App or Vite, when you actually build and deploy to production, this is what you get out of the box with client-side rendering. You get an empty body or almost empty body with just this div that says root. And after then React kicks in. So if you look at this whole file, the only JavaScript file that we have here is this one. This not only contains the whole components that this app has to render, but also React itself. So if I go here, you can see that this is a huge file which contains a lot of things, including the React magic itself. But what I am particularly interested in is essentially this div root. So I'm going to actually search this. I'm going to copy this, Control F, and the second instance that you'll see here is essentially this one. Let's quickly see this again. So here, this is the one. You can see here it says document.getElementById root, and then it renders the JSX. So it basically creates the whole component tree and whatnot. So this is what a normal React application does. I could also check it right here as well. I can right click, go to inspect, and then I can press Command Shift P or Control Shift P and say disable JavaScript. What this technically does is this tells the Chrome browser to not download any JavaScript at all. And that means there will not be any React if there's no JavaScript. So if I refresh the page, first you will see that there is no JavaScript downloaded, which means there's no React. And then if you go to the Elements tab, you see exactly the same thing. There is a div with an ID that is root. There is no React, nothing gets rendered because we have disabled JavaScript. So this is essentially what you get from the server in a normal React application where client-side rendering is the thing to go. Now, if I enable JavaScript with Control Shift P or Command Shift P and you enable JavaScript, go to the network, refresh. Now you can see the JavaScript file and you can also filter it by JavaScript. So here you can click JavaScript and you can see that I've got the JavaScript right here, and then that is why we have the component working or everything in React working at this moment. So that's basically client-side rendering. It's pretty simple, pretty easy, and Next.js also has client-side rendering as we discussed. Now, by default, every component in Next.js is a server-side component, which means that it has server-side rendering enabled by default. For example, if I go to this particular page, and if I tried the same thing here, then I should not be getting get started by editing if this was only a client-side rendering component. But since this is server-side, even if I disable the whole JavaScript first, it will still render the whole page, whereas it could not render this page at all. When we disabled the JavaScript, we saw that it was just a blank screen. However, if I try to do the same thing right here and go and disable JavaScript, so Control Shift P, disable JavaScript, and now if I refresh, you will see still the whole page is rendered. There was no JavaScript involved, or there was no JavaScript downloaded as well, but I still see all of that. And the second method I told you, you right click, you go to view page source, and if I can find this particular thing inside this source, this means that this comes from the server. This comes from the server rendered. So if I search this, you can see automatically this finds it. Get started by editing. So this whole page is rendered on the server and then comes back. So if we look at our Exali draw, this is the process. This essentially, the browser essentially tries to request the information from the server. The server, before sending it back, it renders the whole thing right here. If it renders everything right here, then this comes in the category of SSR, or which is called server-side rendered. And this goes as server-side rendering if every time I refresh this page, it has to render the whole page or the component on the back end before sending it to the front end. And this is really good for one specific thing, SEO, search engine optimization. If your web application, for example, let's look at this page. So this is a course that I've built, which has about 900 plus students enrolled. This whole page, essentially, if I try to look at the view source or view page source, you will not only find just an empty div, but everything from here. Let's say we try to find JavaScript advanced in the view page source, and I should be able to find it. So if I say JavaScript advanced, you can see it right here, right? So all this is actually coming back from the server. This is really good for SEO because now when Google Chrome, or not Google Chrome, but Chrome search engine or Bing or any web crawlers try to make sense of what is this page, they can actually make sense because they see the content. So they're going to be like, okay, this is a heading and the heading says web development basics, which means that this keyword is important for this particular page. And if someone in the world is searching web development basics, the search engine will try to match that with this heading. Or it's not as easy, but there's so many complicated things going on there. But having a good keyword in the heading is one of those. Then you can also use the same keywords in your content, multiple places. There are many more things. But compared to this, if you just get a div with ID root, what does that tell a search engine? Nothing at all about your page. Therefore, your page is not really able to be indexed by any search engine in a good manner. So that's why server-side rendering is really, really powerful. However, that adds a bit of cost to the server because every time now when you need a particular page, it has to be rendered on the server, which requires obviously some CPU usage and some RAM usage as well, but we'll get to that in just a bit. So we checked that this particular component is server-side rendered just by disabling JavaScript and seeing that still I get all the HTML. So this is being generated on the backend, on the server, on the Next.js server, and then you get back the whole rendered HTML, and then you don't need client-side rendering in this particular case. What usually happens in this situation is this. When you're talking about server-side rendering, it renders everything on the backend. It comes to the browser, and then from there, client-side rendering also happens. So there happens something called hydration that happens right here, which means that wherever the server leaves this whole process of rendering, when it has rendered all the HTML, React continues on the front end from there and then adds event listeners and whatnot. We are going to look into that in just a bit. So let's talk about some of the cool examples that I've built for you today. So I'm going to go to my app and show you some of the pages. The first page that we are going to look into is a pure server rendered page, just like the home page, but a bit different. So if I go to this page, you can see there was a loading message and then I saw some content here. And then you can also see on the right side, we have this render count. This render count throughout this video will only show the render count happened on the server, not the client side renderings. This is server side rendering count. So if I'm here and if I refresh the page, this happens once more and now you can see render count too. I can keep doing this and then I'll get a different render count every time. So what happens is I have a fake sort of pause or delay on my backend, which pauses everything for 1.5 seconds, which shows this loader. So just to show that there's a loading time in receiving that data, because I have the data in my server. If I don't put loader, it's going to be too fast. We're not going to see the loading. So just to simulate an action that takes some time, I have a fake loader. Now let's have a look at the code itself. This is my example. So I'm going to show you first the server component. So the server component is inside examples server, and here we have page TSX. This is Next.js 14, by the way, so it's the latest and the greatest maybe. So here we have this server component or this React component or Next.js page, which essentially is a server-side rendered page. How do we know? Because first, this has async right here. This does not say at the top that this is a client component. So this is by default a server-side component or server-side rendered component. When we render this page, first, as soon as the browser tries to request this page, this function gets executed. Then it tries to get the items via this await. So this resolves a promise. And if I go inside there, you can see this is our fake pause or fake delay of about 1500 milliseconds. Then I'm trying to get the items JSON from my public folder, which is right here, which contains a bunch of items, 6 items to be precise. And then what I do is once I get those items, I just return these back. Once this returns it, it comes here as list items. So here we have the array of the items that we have just received. And then we just loop over that array to render a bunch of list items. This is essentially the whole page. You can ignore the with render count. This is something that I'm using to show the render count, but this is the actual content that we are talking about. Everything that you see is server-side rendered. The div, the h1, the p, every list item is server-side rendered, which means that if I go to my browser and if I try to just see by disabling JavaScript, all of this should render, right? Let's try this out. I'm going to go here and I'm going to open the debug tools and then I'm going to just say disable JavaScript. Now you'll see something different. If I disable JavaScript, I don't see the whole content being created. That is because I have a loading TSX that shows this content. So for the time this is happening, which means this component, server component, is trying to get the items. Until this is resolved and returned, this will show the loading TSX content, which is right here. This is the Next.js way of telling the browser that, hey, some data is going to come back. Regardless of this situation, if I go to some other page, for example, this is also a server client component. Here we have a similar situations, but different. Here we don't have a loading page. So let's focus on this one. As soon as you go to this page, it shows the loading message. If JavaScript is enabled, then we'll get the data back. Otherwise, we'll not get the data back. So as soon as you introduce loading in your page, then instead of waiting to get the data in the page and then rendering and then sending back, it immediately returns the loading page. Let me show you. If I right click this and if I go and say, show me the page source, you're going to notice that this page essentially contains the whole loading action. So here you can see loading the server page. This is the page that the browser immediately returns back. And then after the data has been received, then you get the actual data in that situation. But let me show you actually the magic here. If I tell you that we get the data, we also get the rendered HTML back, but we are not able to just show it because JavaScript is disabled, would you believe me? Even if you don't, that's really what's happening. You might think that this loading is the only thing that we get if JavaScript is disabled, but not really. We first get this, yes, and you can see it right here, loading the server page. But we also get the actual rendered data. We are not really showing that but we actually get it. If you scroll down here, you can actually see this div right here, which contains this div, which is the server page, server side rendered, and the UL is as well. So all of this is actually here, but we are not able to show it. Why can't we show it? Because in order to replace the content on the front end, you still need JavaScript. So even if I have both the loading content from Next.js and the actual content from Next.js right here, since my JavaScript is disabled, I can't do anything, or the browser cannot really switch that content. So even for just replacing this with the actual content, you need to have JavaScript enabled. So let's enable that. And then you can also see what happens in the Elements tab. So now if I refresh the page, you're going to see that now, notice just this hierarchy. If I refresh the page, you see the loading here, and here you saw something happening bottom right here. So if I refresh again, you'll see here, it comes right here, and then you can see the data in that regard. So first of all, it shows loading, then it gets the data, and then it replaces it right here up top, and then you're able to see all this content that we just talked about. So this is how the server side rendered components are working. Everything is rendered on the server, nothing is on the client side. The server rendered content, if you are using a loading file, is sort of streamed later on to the front end, and then the front end can basically swap that if the JavaScript is enabled. So as I said in the beginning, this might be a difficult concept to wrap your head around it, but just by experimenting and checking these out and having good console logs or debugger points, you can actually understand what's happening. So we talked about a server component that has a loader and how this works. Initially, you get the loading page, and then your actual page, which is rendered on the server, is streamed sort of towards your front end. Now what I want to also show you is something. If I go to my loading TSX and if I save this, let's go to home. So I'm at home, I'm going to save my file so I have everything refreshed and all the counts are reset to 0 when the server refreshes. Now what I want to do is I want to actually go to my server page, this one. If I go there, you'll see that this says loading and the render count is 1. I go back to home, I go back to server, there was no loading. What? Why? And that is because Next.js basically caches some of the server-side rendered pages, so you are not doing it too often. It automatically handles how and when this data should be invalidated, and you can see the render count right now is 1. After a while, even me changing anything, without me changing anything, the data will be revalidated or unvalidated. And then if I go to home and maybe if I go to server now, you see the loading automatically. Now the render count has changed to 2 because the server did the rendering again there, and now I have a fresh data in this case, or a new HTML rendered directly from the server. But until then, you can see that sometimes or most of the times it would just cache it. And it also depends on the usage. So Next.js automatically does it, but you can also specify how much time do you want a particular page to be cached for, and then you can also say just don't cache anything and then just render all the time for every particular user. So we talked about the server-side rendering in this case. One of the things that you would want to also remember is when we talk about server-side render, let's say this is the route where I'm going to have server-side rendering. And in our case, this is example/server. If 1,000 people request this page, 1,000 different people, there will be 1,000 re-renders, or not re-renders, but 1,000 renders on the server, because each person is trying to access a page which needs to render on the server and then should be sent back. This also can increase the cost of CPU and RAM if more and more people start using your application. So I'm just putting it out there to have a comparison later on. Now that we have talked about this, let's have a look at another component which is not server-side rendered completely and has a chunk that is rendered on the client side. So I'm going to show you the server client component, and I'm going to show you this side by side on the comparison of these two. So the difference between these two components is that this component has both or everything H1, P, UL, everything being rendered on the server, whereas this one has the H1 and P there as server-side rendered, but the list actually has its own component, and this is a client-side component. Apart from that, everything is the same. This still has the await on get items. So this still gets the items JSON essentially from this function that we have created. And then it also renders that using that array. So in here, we were just looping over and rendering the array right here. Now we are actually passing that array into a component as a prop. So if you know React, you know that we can pass it just like this. Now this example list component essentially is a client side component. As you can see, this is use client. So how does the use client component work? And why do we need a use client? Because for some reason, I actually wanted to have a use state inside in here. And I also wanted to have a click listener. If you have a server-side rendered component only, you do not have the possibility of adding any event listeners to it. And you cannot use any hooks at all in a server-side rendered component. So I can't really do all of that in here at all. As soon as I try to do that, let's try it actually. So const, something, and here set something. And in here, if I just start using a use state hook right here, it's gonna start crashing. So here you can see the error that says you're importing component that needs use state. It only works in a client-side component, but none of the parents are marked with use client. So this is a server-side component. You cannot use a hook inside a server-side component. You can also not add any event listeners like click, key up, blah, blah, blah. You can't have that. So I'm just gonna keep it like this. Now let's talk about the server client in this case. So in this case, the example list is the use client component, or is a client-side component, which has a click listener on every single list item. So what I do basically with this click listener is whenever an ally is clicked, I redirect the user to its own page or the list items page. But then I also have the click listener, so I can also console log that item that was clicked as well. So both of those things. Now, you might want to just send this information to Google Analytics, Mixpanel, or do some other API calls or whatever. But if you want a click listener, you need to have the use client. That should be understood. And you can also see that I am passing my list items from my server side to my client component via props. So my client component accepts the props, which is a list item array, and then it renders them just like this. So if I'm looking at this, then that essentially means that if I save this and if I go to my browser, go to server client, you can see that it takes a bit of time. It takes 1.5 seconds to be exact to load the data and then do something about it. Let me show you it once again. I'm going to go to about, save this page so all the counters are reset. Now, I'm going to click this button, but for 1.5 seconds, you will see absolutely no change. And that means the user doesn't see anything at all for 1.5 seconds if you don't have a loading.tsx. So if I click this in 3, 2, 1, click, you can see there was a pause and now you got the data. Whereas if you go to the server component, this also has the same pause, 1.5 seconds, but you see the loading because of the loading TSX. So 3, 2, 1, click, and you see the loading, and then you see the data. So you see what is the difference between these two and the user experience as well. Now, when we talked about the whole experience on what you get back when you're trying to access a component where JavaScript is disabled, or just looking at what comes back, if you have a loading TSX, what you get back when you try to look at the page source is the loading part itself. So here you will find loading the server page, right? But if you try to do the same thing in a server client thing, you might expect that if I have the JavaScript disabled in here, so let's say we do enable, or not enable, but disable JavaScript. Oops. Control-Shift-P, disable JavaScript. Now you would expect that if I refresh the page, since this component is client-side rendered and this list is client-side rendered, I would only get these and I will not get anything else. If I refresh, let's see what happens. Refreshing, 1.5 seconds pause. And then even though the JavaScript is disabled, you can see still this coming in. Now what is this about? This is not rendered on the client side. Even though this was a client-side rendered component or a client-side component, it doesn't mean that it will only be rendered on client side. If a user goes directly to a particular page and goes there for the first time, even though you have a client-side component, it will still be rendered on the server. And that is because SEO and performance both. So now when it goes through this process, it goes to the server client page, gets the items, and then it renders these, but it does not add any event listeners whatsoever or does anything with the state or any hooks. So it still renders the components, but doesn't add anything that is front-end logic. So if I look at the page source for this one, you're actually going to look at the data. So if I do item 5, item 6, you can see all of them being rendered on the server because this is the source, right? Nothing here is client side. Now, if you look at this click handler, if I click a particular list item, I should be seeing this console log. But since JavaScript is disabled, even though this is rendered, you will not have any listeners or any JavaScript listeners at all here. So if I click this, the navigation will happen, but I will not see anything on the console. So if I click now, you can see the navigation happen in 1.5 seconds, but I don't have any console log. That's because JavaScript is disabled. Let's try the same thing now, but with JavaScript enabled. So I'm gonna go and say enable JavaScript, and now I'm gonna refresh. Now this is rendered, but with client-side JavaScript as well. Now when I click this, you're not only going to see the navigation, but also the console log. So 1, 2, 3, click. And you can see I was clicked, was logged right here, and then we have the navigation as well. So now you understand the difference between what is happening on the backend, on the server-side rendering, and what is happening on the client-side rendering. So in summary, all the events, all the hooks, they are supposed to be done on the client side, not on the server side. And that is basically the main reason where you will say, I'm going to create a component as a client side component, because you want event listeners, you want hooks in there. Otherwise, I don't need to move these things to a client side component or client side rendering. I don't really need to, because this is static HTML. I would just render this on the backend or the server side rendering. So I hope this makes sense. Now I also want to show you the caching. So we looked at the caching just a bit, but if I just go to the server page, this is loading server page. I go back here. This was pretty fast. I go back, forth. You don't see any loading. You don't see the 1.5 seconds pause at all. And if I wait for a couple of seconds, then you'll start seeing those, because then the data would have been revalidated in this situation. So yeah, that's essentially Next.js caching the information by default. Now let's look at one final type of component, and that is a server action. And this was introduced recently in Next 14, or this was introduced before even Next 13, but it was not stable. Now it has been stable. Here, the logic is, if I want to have this situation where I have a list of items and I want to add a new item to the list, and I want to also render that as well, how do I do that? So for that, I'm going to show you a comparison between the server action component and also the server client component. So if we compare them both, I'm going to open this in page.csx, and if you have a look at them, they're very, very similar. So you can see that we have the same div h1p, div h1p. This had the example list, but this also has example list, but with a new item form. Now this is where the server action is being used. I use it only to add a new item to the list. Now what is a server action? If I look at this file where I have this function which adds the fake delay, and then we have the fetch API call to get my JSON, then I also have another method that does the same thing, uses the get items function, and then just finds one by ID. But then this is the server action that I am using. You mark a server action by calling use server inside the block scope or the whole file, but I don't want to call all these files server. Why would you want to use this? If you have a situation in Next.js where you want to call a function, a server function, in your client component, not on your server, in your client component, then you are going to use this use server to specify that this function is gonna go into the client or is accessible from the client component. Why am I saying this? Let's have a look at these two other functions which are being used. So get items, right? Get items in the server example, in the SSR example, is being used by the server component on the server during the server-side rendering. This is not a use client. This is not a client component. This is a server component. The server component tries to call a function on the server, gets the data, returns back. Easy peasy, no problem at all. If I go to the server client example, this also has the same thing. This is a server-side rendered component by default. It gets the item on the server, passes that through the client, and the client renders it. But I don't really have this client component calling anything from the server. The only thing that is server function here is essentially this get items. So when this page is being rendered on the server, this calls this function, gets the items, passes this on, the client component renders it. The only job the client component has is rendering and then adding the click handlers. However, now I have a situation where not only I just want to render a bunch of things, for example, render the list of items, but now I also have one use case in which after everything has rendered, I want my front end to do something with the back end. That is a user adding a new thing into the list items. And that is a use case after everything has rendered. In our exactly draw situation, I'm now supposed to call something after CSR has happened or after the browser has received the HTML, and now I need to call something. If I have that situation and I want to be able to access something right here, this is where my server action is accessible or is going to be executed from. This is where we are talking about. And we did not do that in any of the SSR before. This also is the thing that actually created a lot of memes over the internet, and you can find them pretty easily. But how does this work really? So what I want to do is I want to show you the code for this. For my new item form to be able to access this function, what do I need to do? I'm going to show you the code for new item form. You can see that this is a React component. This is a client-side component, which basically accepts a function. This is the server action that I'm passing through the page. So what I do is I'm exporting the action. Let's call this server action. I'm exporting the server action from this file. I'm importing the action in this file, and then I'm passing that to a client component. Because I don't call this function on the server side, otherwise I wouldn't have to actually mark this as use server. What I want to do is to be able to use this server action into my front end code or my client side rendered code. When I pass this function here, then what I do is I say, hey, when this form is going to be submitted, I'm going to call this server action with the form data. So I'm going to pass all the forms data by default to this server action, and I'm going to have this form data. So what happens is I have just an input that has a name value set to item text. This is how you identify each input inside a form. Each input should have a different name. This is the name, item text. Once I hit submit or hit enter, this form uses this action to see what to do. It goes to this action essentially, and then it has the form data. Then it extracts out the input from here, or the value of the input in this case. And then it basically adds a new text to my array. Now where this is adding, you can ignore that for now. But essentially from the form to the server function, we have a direct way of passing information. Now imagine this thing that this is client side code. This action is a server side function or a server function. Traditionally, we are used to doing this via an API call, a post call, a put call, a delete call. But here we are submitting directly something to a server action, and it works by default. Just because we are saying use server, this function is callable from a front end, and this is crazy. This is also something that a lot of senior engineers don't really like, because now we are struggling to actually identify where do I draw the line between the backend and the front end, because you can execute backend code from front end, technically not really execute or have all the access, but it's still, you can imagine. Now, when we submit this form, we are supposed to send this information, and then it should go and add to the item. This is what a server action is essentially. And this is being used in the client side. So I hope you got the holistic idea of what we are talking about here. Now that we have this, what I want to do is to be able to add a particular item. Let's say this is cool item. I added, I submitted it. Now I go to server client. I should be able to see it right here, right? And then if I go to server, I should also be able to see it right here. So I can see it right here, and then I should also be able to see it right here as well in the server action. There you go. So now I can see my data right here. So unless your page is refreshed and all the data is invalidated, you can't really see it. Cool. Now the problem is I want to do it while I'm actually adding this item right here. How do I do that? If I add a new item, how do I refresh this page or show the new data? And that is a question that a lot of people are already asking about server actions, but then also a lot of people would get stuck in that I am 100% sure of. So if we start thinking about it, being a React developer or Next.js developer, you might think, all right, I've submitted a form and this is the action where everything happens. So this goes here with the form data. And then once you get that, you add this right here. So if I could somehow get the form here, then I will be able to do form.reset So this form.reset, and that empties the input. Or if you want to pass the input itself, you can pass that somehow, and that should work. But then we are actually talking about passing a client-side form into a server action. And this is crazy. Would you want to send your form, your front-end logic to your backend? It doesn't make sense, of course. First of all, I would never do this. Secondly, if I see that code, I'm not going to approve it. So you already know. So what do we do here? You will not be sending your form data anywhere else. So what you can do here is, first of all, you can reset the form, but that's a different use case. We have two problems right here. One, how do I show the information right away? Because if I submit something, I don't see it right away. The second thing is, how do I reset the form? Let's tackle the first problem. The first problem can be tackled by telling Next.js to revalidate the data for this whole application or for the path that you're looking at the moment. Right now, you can do it right after pushing the items or the new item to the array by doing something like revalidate path, and it comes from next cache. You can see here that you can give the original path right here, and for now I'm gonna just give it a slash. If you just do it, then you don't need to do anything at all in your form component, and your data will be reflected right away. Let's have a look. Since I've saved my file, my custom thing is gone, and now we have reset to 6 items. Now let's say I say test 1 2 3. If I submit, let's see what happens. Did you see what happened? I did not have to refresh the page or do anything at all, and I got the latest data. If I go to server client, I should be able to see that data right there as well. If I go to server action back, you can see the data here as well. And if I go to server, I will see the data there as well. Test 1 2 3. Let's go back to server action now. I'm going to add one more test, this one. Hit submit. And you can see that this should come here as well. Now, if I go to other pages, that data might be cached. So here you can see server client also has this, and server is loading the new data. So all the data is coming back and forth. Cool, cool, cool. Let's see another one. Test, hit enter. And now if I go here, you can see the test here as well, and server as well. So all the data goes through all of these completely. Now let's talk about how do we reset this whole form, because now the revalidate thing is done. One thing that I want to emphasize right here is, can you really see the amount of code that we have right here? There's no use state, there's no fetch API call, there's nothing. You did not have to create your API for this. You did not have to manage your whole state of all of your inputs, for example, by using the on change listener, then a use state, then updating the state, and then on submit having a submit handler, and then to do all of those things. You could just send the form information from here, and the action took care of it. Now obviously you're missing a couple of things. What happens if this action fails? You want to show the right errors to the user, but you also want to do some validations as well. So just for resetting the form, I'm going to show you how to do that. So instead of calling this function directly, which requires a form data, I'm actually going to say that I'm going to have my own function right here. Let's say this function is an async function, and this receives, of course, a form data. Let's call this form data as well. And inside that, I'm going to call the add item to list myself. So I'm going to say await add item to list, and then pass the form data from here. Now I have the possibility to reset the form right here. In order to reset the form, React, not 101, but if you have worked with React, you know you can use a use ref. So you can say const form ref equals use ref, and here I'm going to just assign this. And then what you can do is you can say ref equals this guy right here. So you have a form ref right here, and you can assign it by or with null in the beginning. Now you have the ref here. You can do form dot reset essentially, but you will have to do form ref dot current and then dot reset. But it has a few problems. First, this form ref can be null because by default this is null, right? Second, you also need to specify the type of it. The type can be specified right here. So you can do HTML form element, and you are assigning it null by default. So in here, all you need to do is you just need to say this exists, and that's cool. It can find the reset because it already has the information that this is a form element. So this is enough for us to reset the form and then to show the data right away. So if I refresh the page, go here, say my new item, submit, the form is going to be resetted and I'll see the new data. So the form was reset as you can see, and I can see the new data as well. So this is how you would work with server side actions or server actions. And if you want more information on server actions, you should look at the Next.js official documentations that also has a good video of using the new React use form status hook, and there are further hooks as well for complex data or complex visuals when it comes to forms and better sort of error handling. Now that we have gone through all of these, we've gone through server side components, we have also gone through client side rendering as well, a combination of those and the server action. Let's go into what happens when you build the application and what to look for. So if I go and try to run this, I'm going to run npm run build, and I'm going to show you something. When you run npm run build, this is the same as when you push your code to, let's say, Vercel or wherever you're deployed your Next.js application. You need to build your app, and you will see a bunch of icons that will show if your page is server-side rendered or statically generated. So let's wait for the build to complete. All right, so we got an error. Let's have a look at this one. So in here, we are trying to get something from something. So let's change that. I think it's called interfaces, and we have item.interface. So let's quickly fix that. Cool. Now let's try to run the build again. Awesome. So now you can see that these symbols show if this is a pre-rendered static content, which means the HTML is generated right now. And this one is dynamic, which means that this is going to be rendered on demand when the client requests it or when some user goes to this particular page. Now you can notice that all of these pages are statically generated, apart from this one, which is always going to be dynamic. Since you're trying to access a particular ID, this cannot be rendered by default. It is always going to be that you go to this page, it is server-side rendered, and then you see the data. But what does this really mean? The thing here is that this is a statically generated page. So let's try something. If I go to run npm run or npm start, we have our production Next.js application running. So let's try to run this. So I'm going to refresh this page, and you can see that immediately I have this page. If I go here, you can see where's the 1.5 thingy, 1.5 seconds delay. No delay. Nothing at all, as you can see. I can go to home, I can go to about. You can see this is super fast because everything is rendered essentially once when we were building the application, and that is all the pages that we just saw are statically generated. There's a HTML created for that one, and that just sends it. It's rendered. Now, if I try to go to a particular page, now you see 1.5 seconds delay, and now you saw that. So if I go back and try to go to item 4, let's click in 3, 2, 1, click. You saw the 1.5 delay, and then you get the item rendered. So this is essentially what you can see when going to different pages as well. What happens if I add a new item? So if I say my new item, if I submit this, now you can see that the item is here. But what happens if I go to server client? I still see the old data. What? Why? Because this is statically generated. Even this is statically generated. The only time that I saw the new data is actually when I added the item. And this is super confusing. Like, I have a new item. Why don't I see that? That is because all of these are statically generated, whereas you might not want them to be statically generated all the time. If I refresh the page, what happens? You can see still, I don't see my new item at all. So this is really crazy, and this is weird as well. So if I want to say that my pages like server action, server client, and server, they're not going to be statically generated, and I want them to be dynamic, just like this particular page, which I click and then go to, then what I can do is I can go to the pages and I can say that I'm going to force them to be dynamic. By default, it's auto. So Next.js decides what to do. So if I go here to the page TSX for server client, I can go here and say at the end, export, and you can put this in the beginning as well. You can say exports const dynamic, and here you can say force dynamic. You have further options as well, like force static, blah, 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 but you can use this one. Now that I have this one done, I'm also going to do this for the server action one, just like this. And I'm also going to do it for the server one as well, just like this. Now, if I try to run the build, you'll see that all of these components that we just looked at or updated are going to be having the lambda icon, which means they are dynamic. So npm run build, and let's see when the build is done. And there we go. Now you can see only the home page, the not found page, and the about page are statically generated, whereas all these pages are dynamic. So if I run npm start now, I should be able to see all the loading or all the magic that we just talked about. So if I go here and refresh on the about page, I can try to go to server action in 3, 2, 1, click. You can see the delay, and now we got the data. I can go to the server client, 3, 2, 1, click, pause, and then it went to this page. And now if I go here, I should be able to see the loading. So 3, 2, 1, click, and there you go. Now these are not statically generated. This is running Next.js production server, and you can see that every time I click this, it essentially re-renders or actually gets the data. Now you can see that it is still fast now because Next.js is internally caching the API request, not the generation part. It will always regenerate or render the component. It's not statically generating the HTML, but the requests can be cached or not. For example, if I click this again, after a while, this page or the data would be revalidated, and you can see the pause there now. Now, if I click again, you can see the data. So it's behaving exactly how we did in the next dev environment. So we are saying that these are supposed to be rendered on demand. You can cache the fetch call or the data call, the items JSON call, but don't really just generate this once and let them go. What this means now is if I go to the server action, I can see the my new item, hit submit. I can see the data right here. And now if I go to other pages which are not cached, I will be able to see them there as well. So here you can see my new item, and this one loading the data can see my new item, and I can go back and forth and see that as well. So this is now behaving like how we want them to behave. So this is crazy, right? When you actually get into the internals of seeing when does it render, when does this cache, when does this generate the page, you really are baffled by what basically helped them make these decisions of when to do what. This is amazing. So finally, what I want to just tell you or reiterate on is, if you have a server-side rendered page, which in our case are all these 3 pages, which are server-side rendered dynamic ones, that means if 1,000 people are requesting those, that means 1,000 requests, that means 1,000 times the server-side rendering will occur. If that scales to 1,000,000, then your server should have enough CPU and RAM, basically the power to render those things, or computing power to be able to do that. If you scale your users, or if your users grow, then you need to scale this process as well, because every time someone tries to request your page, it is essentially doing a render on the server side, unless obviously the APIs are cached, blah, 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 and can give you some cache data for some time, but you will still have a lot of re-renders on or renders on the server side. When we talk about static site generation, this means that if I go to my about page right now, even if 1,000,000 people try to access this page, there will never be even one more render on the server side, because this page is just generated when I run npm run build. Then the about HTML is generated automatically. After then, there's no render on the server at all. So everybody who's trying to access this page will just get the same HTML that was generated when I was building the process or building the app. I'm going to show you an example. So this is my website, codewithsn.dev, and it has some free courses available. So this whole page where you can see this is essentially statically generated, because there's not much dynamic thing going on here. I'm not going to change this course, I don't know, even in a month or even a year. So if I'm not really doing this, then it makes perfect sense to just generate this whole HTML, including the video link, because the video is streamed, but the rest of the content is just static. It doesn't change. It's not dynamic. It's not coming from any external source. Even if it's coming from an external source, I'm just going to build it at that moment and just render the HTML once. Now, even if 1,000,000 people come and they try to access this page, there's not even a single more render on the backend for this particular component, which means that my servers do not need a high computing power, whether it's CPU, RAM. So even if a lot of users come and access this page, I don't really have to worry about that a lot, because I'm not really using server-side rendering. I'm using static site generation in this case. So in summary, 1,000 requests, for a static side generated page or SSG page has 0 server side re-renders further, and the incremental side is everything that is SSG, but it will automatically rebuild the whole page every once in a while. And you can define the configuration. So you can say every week, every 5 minutes, every hour, whatever you want to say. Depending on how frequently your data changes, you can set up the ISR in that regard. So now you know about CSR, SSR, SSG, and ISR, and you're also familiar with some of the gotchas that you need to know when working with all of these. I actually believe that this video is actually one of the most comprehensive guides on how to actually work with Next.js and what are the edge cases that you really need to think about when it comes to caching, when it comes to actually having a server-side rendered versus a statically generated component and whatnot. And finally, I also want to show this thing that what we actually specified as const dynamic has auto right here, but as you can see on this documentation, these are the potential values. For example, you can say for static, which means the particular page will be statically generated no matter what. So you can define all of these values. You can look at them on your own time, but I showed you the most important one, which is I think dynamic, just to mention the use case that we had. So having said that, I hope that you enjoyed this video. I think this was full of knowledge and experiments. I would encourage you to look into your own projects, try to fiddle around. I'm also going to be obviously putting the link of this project in the description so you can play around and explore and then figure out things yourself as well. And if you liked the video, press the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done that. And if you can write a comment and share this video, that would mean a lot to me, because that also helps sharing this knowledge for free to a massive audience that's out there looking for these answers. With that said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, happy coding. I'll see you in the next video.